Aloha and welcome to this screencast I'm calling Blaze for Beginners. This is intended for newbies to Meteor who are interested in learning the original templating language called Blaze. In this screencast, I just want to give you a very 30,000 foot perspective on Blaze that will help you watch tutorials and read the documentation and so forth and have the kind of conceptual model that you need to understand what's going on. So first off, Blaze is a template language, and you've heard of other ones, Angular, React, or Vue, or maybe you haven't, but you will soon. And the reason why we have template languages in web application frameworks is because whenever you present a page, there's a certain amount of data that's static or text or stuff that doesn't vary depending upon the user or the state of the underlying database and so forth. And then there's dynamic content, which is content that does change. It could change based upon the database or the time of day or which user it is and so forth. And so template languages, be they Blaze, React, Vue, Angular, and there's lots of other ones, they're all designed to solve the same simple problem, which is how do we combine together the static and dynamic data in an appropriate way. So let me give you a concrete example. This is from the Bofolios system. Later on in the semester in the class, you'll dive into Bofolios in depth, but it's kind of a convenient way to introduce this. Even if you don't know anything about the application, doesn't matter. I'm showing a page. It has I'm trying to highlight two places where there's data. The footer of the page is static data because that text does not change no matter what page you're on or what user you are or anything like that. On the other hand, the little cards with people's profiles, that's dynamic data because that's what will be displayed on this page is going to change depending upon how many people are in the system, what information they've specified about themselves and so forth. So that's the basic idea between static and dynamic data. Let's look and see how we'll start to look and see how Blaze solves the problem. Let's start with the static content, that's the easy one. And here you can see the Blaze template that's used to generate the footer. And what you can see is that when you write a template using Blaze, the part of it basically just looks like HTML, which is surrounded by this template tag. As you can see, template at the top and bottom. That's not real HTML. That's Blaze stuff. Blaze knows when you enclose some stuff, some HTML inside the template tag, that it knows what to do with that. But inside that template tag, you can see that's just pure HTML. There's nothing crazy going on there. Okay. So that's how you do static content. You just basically have this thing that looks like HTML, but it's augmented with this template element, and you put your static stuff in there, and life is wonderful. Okay, so now let's try to combine some static and dynamic content, and this is actually the template that's used to generate that directory page, or at least part of it. And what you can see here is that there's some stuff in there that looks like HTML, like this div stuff up here, but then there's other stuff that's enclosed in double curly braces. And that's Blaze specific syntax that enables you to do things like have if constructs, so you can have conditionals, and then there's a # each. That's a construct that allows you to do looping. And then there's even this curly brace, angle bracket that enables you to call this template directory profile from within the template directory page. So that's how you build up kind of components and create, basically like little reusable pieces of templates that you can use in a variety of places. Okay, so we're going to come back and look at this a few more times, but the basic idea right now that I want you to see is that the way Blaze combines static and dynamic content is within this template tag. You can just put regular old HTML, plus if you put stuff in this double curly braces, that's called space bars or handlebars syntax. That is what Blaze uses to figure out how to deal with dynamic content. Okay? All right, so here you can see these examples. There's the if tag here. There's a each tag here, and then you close off the if so it can see which, what's enclosed in this conditional. Okay, and then here's the template call at the bottom, or I'm sorry, the subtemplate call here right in the middle, which is the curly brace, angle bracket, calling directory profile within directory page. Okay, so let's now look at another example. In this previous one, you can see we had directory page calling directory profile. Now let's look at directory profile, and if you can, I'll just tell you, the directory profile, this is the template that creates a single card. So you remember we had two cards in our little example Bofolio system, and this is the template that's used to generate each of those cards. And what you can see in here is, again, use of the curly brace syntax to inject dynamic content. And here you can see that the dynamic content is actually referring to some kind of variable and extracting a field from it. And we'll get back to that in a little while. Okay. So we've seen that we can write this kind of augmented HTML, refer to dynamic content, but the question is, well, how does Blaze figure out, what is that dynamic content? What's the specific values? You refer to profile, but what the heck is that? So there's a second piece to Blaze, which is to augment the HTML, kind of the structure of what the page should look like, with code that actually executes to provide that dynamic data. And this is what we'll talk about next. So getting this dynamic content, there's kind of two ways that it happens in general. And these two ways are, first, you can write what's called a helper function and associate it with a template, and then you can invoke that helper function from within that spacebars HTML stuff to get a value. Okay, that's the first way. Second way is that if you're calling a subtemplate if you're calling one template from within another, I'll call the callee subtemplate, but it's just another Blaze template. It's not anything special. Then when one template calls another, if it's received dynamic data somehow through a helper function, for example, it can pass that dynamic data as a parameter into the subtemplate. Okay, so there's the two ways, and in fact, it's really great. This example shows both of these things. So let's first start with the directory page template. You can see here's the HTML here. We showed this before, and we can associate with that template, and you can see the kind of syntax, template.directory page. That's how we actually do the association. We can associate this helper function called profiles. Okay, so that when we encounter this piece of handlebars or spacebar syntax inside this template, we see that it wants to find the value of profiles in order to assign each element of it to this variable called profile. And the way we get the value for profiles is inside another JavaScript file. We have something called template.directorypage.helpers, which is essentially some syntax saying for the template called directory page, which is right here, we're going to establish an object that contains a list of functions. Here's one of them. It's called profiles, and it's going to return the result of invoking the Mongo find function on all of the elements and returning a cursor to all of the elements of the profile collection sorted by last name. Okay, so this is a database access right here. That's the return value of this profiles function, helper function. That profiles helper function is referenced up here in the HTML template, and that gives us a list of profile objects, each of which will be bound to profile, and then we'll execute this subtemplate inside. So that's our first example using a helper function. And you can have all sorts of helper functions and access them in various ways inside your template. And after this, you can go ahead and read the documentation to see all the various varieties of that. But that's the essential idea. We've got some JavaScript code that we establish as helper functions, which we can then refer to inside our template definition. Okay, the second thing is the second way we can get data into a template is by passing the data as a parameter. Okay, so here we have a directory profile, which is this single card. I'm not showing the entire template, just the first little piece of it. But inside a directory profile, we're making all these references to an object called profile and getting the last name field, the picture field, the first name, and interests, and so on and so forth. So where does that profile object come from? Well, it turns out when we invoke directory profile, in order for things to work, we always have to pass a parameter called profile and that should be some object which can then be destructured or dealt with in whatever way you want inside this subtemplate. So it's just parameter passing, okay? And what you can see here is that we have outside of this invocation of the subtemplate, remember we used our helper function to get a collection or a list, well, a cursor to a set of profile objects, and then each function will iterate through it. We'll get exactly one profile object. We'll pass it in as a parameter called profile. So I'm sorry that's a little confusing, but it avoids kind of trying to come up with my profile or other kinds of kind of crazy argument names. But so we pass the object, this profile object in as the value of this parameter profile. Now we can refer to the profile parameter in this subtemplate or template called by the directory page template. Okay, pretty easy. I mean, very straightforward if you're used to coding at all, which all of you are. All right, so that's the basic structure. We were writing these HTML code. We're putting in these space bars or handlebars things to get at dynamic content, and then we got various ways to actually resolve that dynamic content. Now, though, one of the cool things that Blaze does is it understands reactivity. Okay, so I went through this slide in another screencast, which I hope you've already seen, but I'm just going to kind of give you this super quick refresher on how Meteor does reactive updates. We start with a Meteor server. It's connected to a database, and then we've got a couple browsers that have their own mini Mongo database running inside them. And right now you can see that the databases all contain the value Ford, or the string Ford is the value of car. And so what happens if inside this browser they want to click a button to update car to be from Ford to General Motors? So that browser gets its database changed, and then the value displayed in that browser is General Motors. So that's good, but no one else knows about it. Then we update the server, so now the server has the value of General Motors, and then the cool thing that Meteor does is it will then go ahead and tell all the other clients, update all of the other local databases. And in my last lecture, I kind of glossed over the fact that somehow magically updating this database was going to result in the user's browser now displaying this new value. Okay? So that's what Blaze actually does. That's one of the values of using Blaze, or one of the other templating languages that's tightly integrated with Meteor, is that they know how to update the rendered page when the underlying database changes. Okay, and so in Blaze, the way this happens is that various variables and functions can be, in a sense, tagged as reactive. And what that means is that when the local database changes, Blaze is going to automatically rerun helper functions associated with that aspect of the local database and re-render any code that's affected by that helper function. Okay? And what's cool about this is, first, it's super cool because then your display can just update in real time as the underlying database changes. You don't have to press refresh or anything like that. And then the second thing that's cool about it is, for the most part, you don't really have to think about it. It just kind of works. So there's for the common use cases, there's no additional thinking involved. You just get this kind of for free, and that's nice. So let's see how this actually works. We're going to go back to this directory page helper function, and you can see that we have this helper function called profiles, and it's returning the cursor, the Mongo cursor, that results from invoking find with these arguments. And these arguments basically means find everything in this particular collection, and then sort it by the value of the last name field. Okay, and then as we said before, we refer to this helper function inside this little piece of code here. Okay, now where things are super cool is that Blaze understands that profiles is a reference to a collection, and that collections can change. And so therefore, whenever this particular collection changes in the database, Blaze is smart enough to rerun this particular function, and then be aware that this function is referenced inside this piece of code. So just this little slice of the page is going to be re-rendered. Okay? So it doesn't even refresh the entire page. It's smart enough to say, hey, when profiles changes, I know that just the contents of this, part of the template needs to be re-rendered in order to display the update. Okay, so that's how reactive update works in Blaze. Conclusions, all right? If you're looking at Blaze versus React, Angular, Vue, etc., and trying to understand which do I want to use, which is better, there's no better, they're just differently enabled or something, differently abled. Blaze, I'll start with the bad parts first. Blaze only, it's kind of specific to the Meteor platform. There's no intrinsic reason it couldn't be more general than Meteor, but no one's made the effort to make it more general. So it's, when you learn Blaze, you're learning a technology that's specific to Meteor, unlike learning Angular, Vue, React, which is a more generic templating language. The user community, because it's specific to Meteor, is much smaller than for these other platforms. And then one of the real concrete, specific things is that when you have a lot of different components in a page, and the state of one component depends upon others, and so you need a lot of cross-component communication as state is changing in unpredictable ways, that can get to be a little bit of a hassle in Blaze. I'm not going to lie. Okay, there's design patterns you can use to deal with it, but React in particular solves that problem much better for the complicated case than Blaze does. On the other hand, the things that I find kind of compelling about Blaze, at least in the context of this class where you're learning Meteor for the first time, you might even be learning web application development for the first time, is there's so much less code for the common case that you would write in Blaze than you would write in React, for example. React is very verbose with respect to code, and it's way simpler to learn. I mean, having watched this 10-minute screencast, you basically can find your way through a lot of Blaze right away. Not so much in these other frameworks. Okay, so I've been trying to kind of come up with a pithy way of explaining Blaze, and this is my conclusion. Blaze makes simple things more simple, but makes complicated things more complicated. Okay, so the basic idea is if you, in simple cases and for relatively simple web apps, Blaze is a very, very simple way to do it. Maybe the simplest of all the frameworks. On the other hand, when you start trying to do complicated things in a web app, and this inter-component state communication is a good example, then Blaze you start to fight against Blaze to make things work exactly as you want, and then a template language like React might be a better choice. But I will say that most web apps, most of the time, are mostly simple. So Blaze really, handles a lot of the use cases pretty well. Want to learn more? You're going to need to learn more. This isn't enough to really understand Blaze to use it. It's hopefully enough that you understand how to read Blaze and make your way into the more complicated places. You can start by looking at the Meteor guide. It has a general chapter on user interfaces, which tries to take a high-level view and talk about all the different, not really independent of the particular templating language that's used. So that can provide some details. The more specific stuff about Blaze and a very nice documentation for it is at blazejs.org. So I encourage you to go take a look at this documentation, at least skim it, and then you can start looking at examples and going through tutorials, and you'll be able to come back to this to figure out stuff you don't understand. All right, happy blazing.